When you implement a custom validation attribute in MVC3, you can now override a version of the isValid method that receives a validation context parameter. This validation context parameter contains information about the validation that's being performed, for instance, the type of the view model that's being validated and the metadata associated with it. If we think about how the compare attribute is implemented, it makes use of this validation context parameter because it needs to get other information from the view model. So for instance, one of the properties on that validation context is the object type, which is the type of the view model. We can use that type object to get the property metadata for the other property that we want to compare our value to. And then we can use that property information to get the value from the view model object instance. Once we have that other property value, the other date or the other password value, we can compare to see if our value is equal to that other value. Let's take a look at implementing a custom validation attribute. When a user enters a start date and end date for a time card, we'd like to ensure that the end date is greater than the start date. One way to do this is to build a custom validation attribute. So I'm going to create a new class, and we'll call this the greater than date attribute class. It's going to derive from the validation attribute class that is in system.componentModel.data annotations. And the first thing we'll add here is a constructor, and we'll force the developer to pass in the name of the other property that we want to compare ourselves with. So this will be other property name, and I'll just use ReSharper to go ahead and create a property for me to hold that value. The next step would be to override the isValid method. We'll override the version that takes a validation context parameter. And by default, we'll return null. When you return null, you're saying there were no problems with validation. As far as we can tell, everything is valid about this particular property that we're looking at. But we're going to have to check that to make sure. So the first thing we'll need to do is we'll need to extract the other date time that we need to compare against. And to do that, we'll need a property info object. So let's say other property info. And we can do that by going through the validation context and say, give me the object type of the model, and use that to get the property that has this name, other property name. That'll give us back a property info. Then we can use that to extract a value. So I will plan to coerce the value that we get back into a date time, and we'll get it by saying other property info dot get value. We need to pass in the object instance that we're getting a value from. That's available from the validation context. It's the object instance property. And we don't need to pass in any sort of indexing parameter. That should give us back the other date. We can also coerce the incoming value into a date time to get this date. And now we can say if this date is less than or equal to other date, then we have a validation problem. This is going to fail. When validation fails, we need to return a new validation result. And a validation result needs an error message. So we'll need to construct some sort of error message. For right now, I'm going to start off with an empty string, just so we can do a build and make sure everything works. That's good. So an error message should really be built using an error message string property that we inherit from the base class of validation attribute. By using that error message string property, you will allow the user to customize the error message or localize it if they need to run the application in different locales. The best time to set a default error message string then is in the constructor. And actually what you could do is just chain along to the base class constructor, and there's a version that takes the default error message. And this is a formatting string, so we can use parameter placeholders inside of it. And so our default error message should look something like this. This field name must be greater than some other field name. That's the default error message. And we can take control over formatting the error message by overriding format error message. That is passed in the name that represents the name of this field. And so what we can do here is say return string.format, use the base class error message string property, and pass in both the name, this display name, that'll go in placeholder 0, and the other property name, that'll go in placeholder 1. And now coming back here, computing this message is really easy. It's just format error message, and we'll get the name from the validation context. So validation context dot display name should give us the friendly display name for this property. Everything is building, so let's go to the time card and say that the end date should be greater than the start date. Let's do a build. Let's run the application. And let's try to create a time card. I'll go ahead and put in a username with some hours, and now make the start date 114 and the end date 11. And you can see that we get our error message. End date must be greater than start date. Now let's make this 131. And everything worked just fine. We passed validation. One of the reasons that validation was so easy to write was because we now have that validation context parameter that comes into isValid. That gives us a lot of information about the model and other pieces of metadata and information about the model.